Jar of Greed has perhaps one of the simplest effects in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm pretty sure it actually has the least amount of text in any card out of the 8,000 or so that we have. Yet, Jar of Greed doesn't see any competitive play, and today I wanted to talk about why that is, and also I wanted to talk about it because the principles that can be applied to why Jar of Greed doesn't see play can actually be applied to many different cards when you're building any deck. This is helpful because a lot of people have been asking me for deck building tips and stuff like that, and I think that if you've been asking for that, this is the video that you want to watch, because while we are going to focus on comparing Jar of Greed to a lot of different cards, a lot of those comparisons can be made with other monster cards and spell cards and all sorts of different things in this game. So why is Jar of Greed not played? Well, to start off with, let's take a look at the times Jar of Greed was played. Jar of Greed was played in a variety of Chainburn deck lists. It also saw some play in Exodia and Final Countdown, but outside of those decks, which are all sort of unconventional strategies, Jar of Greed has basically never popped up in a competitive sense. And that's sort of surprising because card draw is really important in Yu-Gi-Oh! And Jar of Greed is pretty much the definition of a cycle card, because all you do is cycle out your one copy of Jar of Greed for whatever card is on the top of your deck. There's no major benefit of doing this. You don't gain a bunch of life points, but there's no major downside of it either, and yet Jar of Greed sees basically no play. Why is that? Well, the first comparison we can make, and the theme with this is that not all draw cards are created equal, is we can compare Jar of Greed to Upstart Goblin. Now, Upstart Goblin is essentially the spell version of Jar of Greed, except it has a downside, well, a theoretical downside of giving your opponent 1,000 life points. And what we can sort of gain by looking at how Upstart Goblin was one of the most popular cards from 2013 through when it got limited, Upstart Goblin, because of it being a spell card, kind of goes to show that spells that have the same effect as trap cards but with slight drawbacks tend to be better than their trap card counterparts. And the reason for that is fairly simple. Upstart Goblin is a card you can play immediately. When you draw it going first in your 5-card hand, you don't have to wait around to get that extra draw. It is an immediate cycle, where Jar of Greed is a card that if you draw going first, it's essentially like playing with a 4-card hand, because you have to set the Jar of Greed and then wait a turn to get the effect. Now that does have some benefits, the benefits being if your opponent tried to destroy your back row with a card like Twin Twisters, you could then chain the Jar of Greed. But in general, those sort of fringe applications where you're chaining stuff to not get blown up by back row are going to be less applicable than the speed of a card like Upstart Goblin. So what the main takeaway I'm trying to say here is, like I said earlier, spells that have the same effect as traps, the exact same effect as traps, but some slight drawback, tend to outclass those trap cards simply for the fact that they are spell cards and therefore faster. Now let's compare Jar of Greed to Reckless Greed. These cards are not as similar in effect as Upstart Goblin and Jar of Greed were, but they both have the same principle of that they're trap cards that give you draws. Now let's look at this, because Reckless Greed has a much bigger drawback than Upstart Goblin. You actually skip your next 2 draw phases. Now that's a huge downside, and the thing with Reckless Greed is that it has seen tons of play, and Reckless Greed gives you 2 cards instead of 1 card. So what sort of knowledge can we apply to the fact or the reasoning that Reckless Greed has seen play and Jar of Greed has not? Well, the main takeaway here is that 2 trap cards, or I mean if we're talking in a broader sense, 2 cards that have similar effects, but one gives you a plus in card advantage, is usually going to outclass the other one, even if that plus and card advantage has a sort of drawback in tempo, because Reckless Greed is a card that gives you 2 cards for 1 card, so it's an immediate +1. However, you are losing some tempo, not only because it's a trap card, which would be the same case with Jar of Greed, but also because you're skipping your next 2 draw phases. Now, the real thing that's happening here is you're sort of speeding up one of those 2 draw phases by getting that second card early, so you're really only losing 1 draw, 2 turns later, because that first draw phase that you're skipping, you're actually getting that card the second you activate Reckless Greed. So while you are technically losing tempo in the long run, the decks that Reckless Greed has been popular in have been able to really take advantage of those extra draws. They're usually combo decks that want to see a bunch of different pieces at one time, and they were able to actually end the game before they got to the point where that loss in tempo mattered. Because during the turn that you activate Reckless Greed, you are getting a free +1 with 0 drawback, and actually you're gaining tempo because you're getting a free draw for nothing, which makes the weight of actually having to set the trap card a lot more worthwhile than compared to Jar of Greed, which only gets you 1 extra card, even if it doesn't have any drawback. Now let's compare this to sort of a broader sense and take a look at 2 cards that don't draw you cards, but that have very similar effects, and one actually has an upside. So if we compare Mystical Space Typhoon to Dust Tornado, what can we learn? Well, they both have the same basic effect of being able to destroy a back row. That makes them pretty much on even playing ground. However, Dust Tornado comes with a benefit. It's not that Mystical Space Typhoon comes with a drawback. It really doesn't. It's fairly simple. But Dust Tornado also lets you set a card from your hand to your back row. Now that can sort of jumpstart your other trap cards online, because then they'll be ready to use a turn earlier. But it's also really useful for that situation that I mentioned earlier, where if your opponent Twin Twisters your Dust Tornado, you can chain the Dust Tornado, pop one of their back row, and then set a new card that would not have been able to be targeted by the Twin Twisters. So that's really good in combination with cards that you want to, that are trap cards that you want to use on your turn, but you don't necessarily want to use on your opponent's turn, so you'd rather keep them away from your opponent's back row removal. Stuff like Call of the Haunted is really good on your turn for sort of comboing off. Things like that you really want to use on your turn, even though they're trap cards. Dust Tornado gives you that huge benefit of actually speeding up that process by a turn, and also letting them not be destroyed by your opponent's back row removal. So why is Dust Tornado sort of not as good as Mystical Space Typhoon, especially when we look at a format where both cards are legal at 3 copies per deck? Well, the big takeaway here is that traps with upsides are often worse than spells that don't have those upsides, as long as the spells don't have drawbacks either. But if we're looking at 2 cards that have the exact same effect, but the trap has an upside, the spell card is often better just because, once again, like in the case of Upstart Goblin, it's a spell card. And Mystical Space Typhoon is especially good because it's a quick play spell card, so it has all the benefits of both traps and spells without any of their inherent drawbacks. The drawback of spells, at least normal spells, being that you can't use them on your opponent's turn. The drawback of traps being that you have to wait a turn to use them. Quick play spells are pretty much the most versatile spell and trap card type out there, so Mystical Space Typhoon gets that huge benefit of being able to sort of take the place as a trap card in the times that you actually want it to be like that. But yeah, the big takeaway here is that even if a trap has a upside, and in this case it's sort of a marginal upside, it's not like a huge upside, it's not like also drawing you a card, in which case that card would be insane, but in those cases sometimes the spell is actually still better. And the last thing that I kind of want to mention with Jar of Greed, if you haven't been able to understand from all these comparisons, is that there are just a lot of other draw spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! That are much, much better, and in all these cases, much faster. So we can look at a card like Allure of Darkness. Now, there are plenty of cards that are pretty much this card exactly. It's a 2-for-2 trade instead of a 1-for-1 trade, so you're not gaining any advantage. You're trading the Allure of Darkness and the Dark Monster for 2 fresh draws, just like you're trading the Jar of Greed for 1 fresh draw. So they're not plus in card economy, but they are sort of faster than Jar of Greed, even though they make you banish a card. But there's like a bunch of different Allure of Darkness cards. There's like the Fairy one, there's the Blackwing one, there's Destiny Draw, all sorts of cards like that. Those are usually played instead of Jar of Greed. We can also look at a card like Card of Demise, a card that actually has the potential to +2 in card advantage. which is pretty rare on sort of card draw cards. But obviously there's a bunch of downsides attributed with Card Demise. You have to build your entire deck around it, and not every deck can play it, but it's still played more than Jar of Greed just because it's faster and gains you a ton of advantage if you can build your deck around it. And then, of course, it's impossible to talk about card drawing effects without at least mentioning Pot of Desires. Whether or not you agree that it's a good card or a bad card, we can just look at statistics and know that Pot of Desires is a very good card. It has hundreds, if not thousands, of tops in the past year, so obviously it's pretty strong. Not every single person can be crazy. Not everyone can just be getting fluke draws with Pot of Desires. It's clearly a powerful card, even with the drawback. And then we can look at it, it's sort of like the same comparison with Reckless Greed, where the tempo lost from Pot of Desires in that you're banishing 10 cards from your deck doesn't actually matter if you just kill your opponent before those 10 cards matter. And a lot of the decks that are playing Pot of Desires actually can achieve that sort of 2-turn kill or 3-turn kill before those 10 cards really matter. So by taking a look at Jar of Greed and comparing it to all these different cards, and also kind of showing you how you can use this philosophy with other cards in the same way that I looked at Dust Tornado and MST, you can see that Jar of Greed just has too much competition to actually be played at a competitive level. This card isn't terrible, it's just outclassed. But hopefully you guys enjoy this discussion. I know in the last couple of these videos, a lot of you have said that I've been too harsh on the people that play these cards, so hopefully this one was a little lighter and friendlier, and we'll see what the response is. I hope that it's good. But yeah, I'll see you guys later. Bye.